Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we will take a slow journey, not through chaos, not through noise, but through a time long past where the world was changing and history unfolded in quiet ways. Our story is about the Western Front of the First World War, but not the battles, not the violence, only the gentle, steady movements of time, of people, of places. Imagine a calm map slowly unfolding, towns and rivers marked in soft ink, little lines showing where soldiers moved, where they rested, where treaties were signed, and where letters traveled home. You are safe here, in a quiet room. The sounds of the outside world softened. As we begin, allow your breathing to slow. Inhale softly and exhale. And let us step, very quietly, into the year 1914. Segment 1. The summer of 1914. In the summer of 1914, the air in Western Europe was warm. Golden fields of wheat swayed gently in the breeze, and yet something was quietly shifting beneath the calm dot. In Paris, people strolled along the boulevards. Cafes were full of soft chatter. In London, newspapers wrote about alliances and treaties. But far from the capitals, in the quiet countryside of Belgium and northern France, life carried on as it always had. The Western Front did not exist yet. There were only small villages, winding rivers, old farmhouses, and roads lined with poplar trees. But as August came, diplomats moved between cities. Telegrams clicked softly in offices. Railway timetables were adjusted, not with haste, but with a kind of steady inevitability. Segment 2. The first movements by late summer. Railways began to hum more than usual in small stations. Passengers noticed unfamiliar faces, men in uniform sitting quietly reading letters from home. There was no rushing, only the measured rhythm of steam engines and the slow turning of wheels. Across Belgium, quiet bridges over small rivers became points of interest on maps in faraway offices. The sound of boots on cobblestone was not yet loud, just scattered footsteps here and there as regiments moved in orderly fashion. The Western Front was forming, not with sudden drama, but with slow, careful steps. Segment 3. The quiet advance. Through September of 1914, the map of Western Europe changed slowly. Lines on paper began to curve westward, then northward, as troops moved along winding roads. In the countryside of France, farmhouses still smoked gently from their chimneys. Children still walked to school along dirt paths, but occasionally the sound of passing columns of soldiers echoed softly across the fields. It was not the noise of battle, but the low murmur of organized movement. Horses pulling supply carts, the creak of wooden wheels, the steady pace of marching boots. The front was becoming a line, not just on the map, but in the landscape itself. Segment 4. Along the rivers played an important role in these early days. The Meuse, the Aisne, the Marne, their slow-moving waters became natural guides for armies. Bridges were checked, ferries operated more frequently, and small river towns became temporary centers of activity. Locals often watched from doorways, as groups of soldiers paused to rest by the banks, their uniforms dusty from long marches. These rivers, which had carried fishermen's boats for centuries, now quietly bore the reflections of tents, supply wagons, and flags. Segment 5. Letters and news. While the movements along the front were slow, news traveled more quickly. In Paris, cafes still served coffee in the morning sunlight, but conversations were increasingly about troop positions, alliances, and distant towns whose names now appeared in the newspapers. Letters traveled steadily along the postal lines, not rushed, but in the careful rhythm of the era. Soldiers wrote about the weather, about the villages they passed, about the food they shared. It was a time when the daily pace of life continued, even as the front line quietly lengthened across the map. Segment 6. Autumn settles in as the weeks moved into autumn. The air along the Western Front grew cooler. Leaves along the poplar-lined roads turned golden, then brown, drifting slowly to the ground. The pace of movement also slowed. Troops were not in a hurry now. They had found their positions. Instead of long marches, there were careful adjustments. Small changes in where lines rested. In the towns behind the lines, life settled into a new rhythm. Shops continued to open, bakers prepared their bread each morning, and church bells still rang softly across the fields. Segment 7. The first winter. By the time winter approached in late 1914, the front had become still. It stretched from the Belgian coast, across northern France, to the borders of Switzerland. In the cold months, movement was quieter. Frost settled on rooftops. Smoke from chimneys rose into pale skies. And along the line, soldiers adjusted to a slower, steadier life. They repaired shelters, wrote more letters home, and learned the routine of watch, rest, and small duties. Beyond the front, in towns and villages, people adapted. Railway workers grew used to transporting supplies. Farmers continued their work, their fields now part of a larger landscape, marked by maps and timetables. Segment 8. Diplomacy in the background, while the front remained still. In the cities far behind, diplomats and ministers continued their patient work. In London, in Paris, in Berlin, meetings were held in quiet offices with tall windows and shelves of books. Discussions were deliberate, words chosen carefully, reports reviewed at a measured pace, while the soldiers' lives moved. To the rhythm of daily tasks, these quiet negotiations shaped how the war would continue. But for now, on the Western Front, the days passed slowly. One, much like the next, Segment 9, early 1915. As the new year arrived, the Western Front remained steady. Snow melted in some areas, leaving the ground damp and soft. The fields beyond, the lines were quiet again, with only small movements visible from a distance. Soldiers continued to receive parcels from home, small comforts of food, scarves, or tobacco. Villagers near the front learned to live with the constant but calm presence of troops. Each day followed another, marked by meals, letters, and the occasional arrival of new units. Segment 10. The slow rhythm of 1915. The year 1915 unfolded quietly. Along the Western Front, the positions established in the previous year largely held in the spring. Fields slowly turned green again. Farmers worked their land where it was safe, sowing seeds as they always had. From a distance, the front appeared almost motionless, small adjustments in the line, but no sudden changes. Soldiers settled into a pattern of life that felt almost timeless. They rose at similar hours, stood watch, wrote letters, shared meals, and rested. Each day blended softly into the next, like the steady turning of a clock. Segment 11. Life behind the lines. Behind the front, life in towns and villages took on its own rhythm. Markets continued on their usual days. Trains arrived at small stations with regularity, carrying supplies, letters, and passengers. In cafes, people spoke in low voices. They discussed news from the front, but also daily life, the weather, the harvest, the comings and goings of neighbors, The war was present, but it moved slowly here. Everyday routines carried on, providing a steady background to the events along the line. Segment 12. Summer of 1915. By summer, the air was warm. Again over the countryside of northern France and Belgium. The poplar-lined roads were dry and dusty, and sunlight reflected off the rivers dot along the front. Soldiers adapted to the heat by working in the cooler hours of the morning and evening. The afternoons were slower, marked by rest, reading, or quiet repairs to equipment. In the towns further back, children played in open fields, their games a reminder of life before the war. Shops displayed fresh produce, and the sounds of carts on cobblestones filled the streets. Segment 13. Autumn of 1915. As autumn returned, so did cooler air and changing leaves. The fields shifted from green to gold and then to brown. By now, the Western Front was firmly established. The lines had barely moved in a year, and so life along them had grown almost routine in villages near the front. People had grown accustomed to the presence of soldiers. Troops came and went in steady patterns, some units rotating away, others arriving fresh. It was a time of patience, of waiting, of living each day quietly, without sudden change. Segment 14. The gentle arrival of 1916. The year 1916 arrived. Quietly along the Western Front. Winter had settled in, bringing cold mornings and pale skies. Frost lay lightly on rooftops, and the rivers moved more slowly under thin veils of mist. The front itself had changed little. Positions remained steady, and life along the line continued with its familiar rhythm. Soldiers rose at dawn, tended 2 small tasks, and shared warm drinks in the cold air. In the villages nearby, chimneys smoked steadily, and markets sold winter vegetables, fresh bread, and simple goods. Life was patient here, unhurried by the passing weeks. Segment 15. The winter routine. January and February passed much as they had the year before. The cold weather slowed most activity, leaving the days calm and measured. Troops near the line found small ways to keep themselves occupied, mending clothing, carving bits of wood, or reading by lantern light. In towns further back, railway stations were busy but orderly. Trains arrived on schedule, unloading supplies and passengers before moving on. Though the war continued, there was no rush here. Time moved steadily forward, one day at a time. Segment 16. Spring returns. By March, the air began to soften. Snow melted from the fields, and small green shoots appeared in the hedgerows. Birdsong returned, a quiet reminder that another season had come. Along the front, soldiers welcomed the change. The ground grew firmer, making daily life a little easier. In the countryside, farmers prepared their land, working with the same care as always. The cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting continued, as it had for generations. Segment 17. Summer along the front. Summer brought warmth and longer days. The rivers reflected bright skies, and the roads were dry once more. Life along the Western Front remained steady. Soldiers kept their routines, while in the towns behind them, people carried on with their own daily patterns. Markets were lively with seasonal produce. Cafes opened their windows to the warm air, and the sound of quiet conversation drifted into the streets. The war was still present, but here, in the daily lives of those along the front, it felt measured and constant, like the ticking of a slow clock. Segment 18. The quiet closing of 1916, as summer gave way to autumn in 1916. The landscape changed once more. Leaves along the quiet roads turned amber and gold, drifting slowly onto the earth. The air carried the scent of wood smoke. As evenings grew cooler, the Western Front remained steady. Lines held their familiar positions, with only small adjustments that seemed to matter more on paper than in the fields. For those living near the line, this stability had become a kind of normal life. Shops stocked their shelves, trains ran on, their timetables, and the rhythm of each day continued. Segment 19. The first frost of winter as winter approached once more. Frost appeared on the rooftops and hedgerows. The mornings were quiet, with mist hanging low over the rivers. In the towns behind the front, people gathered indoors, sharing warm food and conversation. Along the line, soldiers prepared for another season of cold. Routine tasks continued, but much of life was about keeping warm, maintaining equipment, and staying patient. The year drew to a close without sudden change. Time moved gently, carrying everyone toward the new year ahead. Segment 20. The arrival of 1917. The dawn of 1917 came quietly. The world along the Western Front looked much the same as it had the year before. The lines were still in place, the villages still stood, and life continued with its familiar pace. In the cold weeks of January and February, there was little movement. The front seemed almost timeless now, a constant presence in the landscape, unchanged except for the seasons. In towns and villages, people marked the passing year with small gatherings, meals, and the hope of spring to come. Segment 21. The spring of 1917. By March, the snow and frost began to retreat once more. The rivers flowed more freely, and fields slowly turned green. Along the front, soldiers adjusted to the softer weather. Tasks that had been difficult in the cold became easier in the spring air. Letters continued to arrive from home, carrying news of families, farms, and quiet towns far away. Life here moved forward, one steady day at a time. Segment 22. The steady days of mid-1917. By summer of 1917, the Western Front remained familiar. The sunlight fell across the same lines, the same villages, the same quiet rivers. In the towns behind the front, life was measured and steady. Markets still filled with fresh produce, children played in open squares, and church bells continued to mark the hours. For soldiers, the days blended into one another. The work was routine, the faces familiar. Letters from home were read and reread in the warm evening light. Segment 23. Autumn. Along the line, as autumn approached, the fields changed color once more. The green faded to gold and then to brown, as leaves drifted to the ground. Life along the Western Front adapted to the cooler air. Warm clothing was brought out, fires were lit in the evenings, and the pace of life slowed in nearby towns. People prepared for winter, storing food and repairing homes. The rhythm of the seasons continued, unchanged by the passing years. Segment 24. Winter of 1917. Winter came again to the front. Frost covered the fields, and mist hung over the rivers in the morning. Soldiers kept warm with extra layers, hot drinks, and steady routines. The cold months were quiet, with less movement and fewer changes in the villages behind the lines. Families gathered indoors, sharing stories and meals. Outside, the streets were still, the air crisp and calm. Segment 25. The new year of 1918. As the year 1918 began, the Western Front looked much the same. The lines stretched across the same familiar places, steady and unchanged. The winter slowly gave way to spring. Snow melted, fields began to show green once more, and the air softened. Life on the front continued as it had for years, patient, steady, and measured. Each day was much like the one before, a quiet progression toward the warmer months. Segment 26. Spring of 1918 by March of 1918. The Western Front was still a familiar line across the landscape. The fields turned green once more, and the rivers reflected the pale blue of early spring skies. Soldiers welcomed the change in weather. The days were milder, the ground firmer, and life felt a little lighter. Letters continued to arrive, each one bringing a quiet connection to home. In the towns behind the lines, the streets grew livelier as the air warmed. Markets filled with fresh produce, and cafes opened their doors to the sunshine. Segment 27. Summer of 1918, summer returned to the Western Front much as it had in years before. The roads were dusty beneath the bright sun, and the fields swayed gently in the warm breeze. Daily life along the line was steady. Soldiers performed their duties, repaired equipment, and rested in the long evenings. In the countryside, farmers tended their crops, preparing for the harvest to come. The rhythm of life continued, unbroken by haste. Segment 28. Autumn approaches as the months passed. The air began to cool once more. Leaves turned golden and fell quietly to the earth. Along the front, soldiers noticed small changes. There was a sense that the long war might be drawing toward a close, though life on the line remained steady in towns and villages. People spoke in low voices about what might come next. Still, the daily routines continued, just as they always had. Segment 29. The closing months of 1918 by late autumn. The Western Front had grown quieter. The long years of waiting and steady life along the line seemed to be nearing their end. In early November, there was news that the war was coming to a conclusion. The word spread slowly along the line, carried by quiet conversations and official notices. There was no sudden change in the landscape. The rivers still flowed, the fields still lay beneath the pale sky, and the villages stood as they had for years. Segment 30. The armistice on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. The armistice was signed. It was a quiet moment along the Western Front. The soldiers went about their duties much as before, but now there was a gentle stillness, a knowledge that the long line across the land would no longer be the same. In towns and villages, church bells rang, their sound carrying softly across the fields. People gathered quietly, speaking of the years gone by and the hope for the days ahead. Segment 31. A gentle conclusion. The Western Front slowly faded from daily life. The lines that had been drawn so carefully across maps were now being erased. The soldiers returned to their homes, the villages resumed their old rhythms, and the rivers continued to flow. The land that had been so constant through the years returned to its natural pace. Seasons passed, harvests came and went, and life settled once more into quiet, everyday patterns. And as our story closes, the Western Front becomes a memory, a line that once crossed fields and rivers, now replaced by the steady, timeless rhythm of the land. You may rest now, as time flows gently forward, and the world becomes still once more. Segment 32. The quiet years after. In the months following the armistice, the Western Front was no longer a place of steady military life. The lines were emptying, and the land was slowly returning to its older ways. Roads that had carried troops now felt lighter, with carts carrying goods for markets once more. Railway stations returned to civilian timetables, their platforms filled with travelers heading home, merchants moving goods, and families reuniting. The towns that had lived for years beside the front now found themselves quieter, their streets filled with everyday sounds, the call of a shopkeeper, the turning of a cartwheel, the ringing of a distant bell. Segment 33. The land restores itself through 1919. The countryside changed. Fields that had stood untouched for years were worked again by farmers. Gardens were replanted, hedgerows trimmed, and orchards cared for. Once more, rivers that had reflected soldiers' camps now reflected quiet bridges and fishermen's boats. Birdsong returned in greater numbers, filling the air in spring. The land healed itself slowly, as nature always does, moving at its own patient pace. Segment 34. Life resumes for those who had lived along the front. The return to normal life was gradual. Shops reopened with regular hours, schools welcomed children back, and weekly markets regained their old liveliness. The years of the front became something remembered in quiet conversations. People spoke of the days gone by, but more often they spoke of the present, of the weather, the harvest, and the future ahead. Segment 35. The front becomes history as more time passed. The Western Front became less a physical place and more a memory. Maps that had once been marked with careful lines now showed open roads, rivers, and towns without division. The front existed only in records, in stories, and in the quiet recollection of those who had been there. Life along its path returned to the timeless patterns that had always been there. Seasons turning, markets opening, bells ringing, rivers flowing. Segment 36. The early 1920s by the early 1920s. The old Western Front was a line only on memories. Map. Villages along its path were alive again, their markets bustling on certain days of the week, their cafes filled with the sound of quiet conversations. The fields, once quiet, were now full of the steady work of planting and harvesting. Oxen pulled ploughs, children walked along the edges of meadows, and birds filled the hedgerows. Visitors occasionally came to see places they had read about in newspapers years before. They found small towns living quietly, with little to mark. The years when the front had been so close. Segment 37. The changing countryside as more years passed. The countryside began to show no sign of the old front at all. The roads, lined with poplar trees, were smooth again, carrying carts, bicycles, and the occasional motor car. Rivers flowed as they always had, passing under stone bridges into villages that now had fresh coats of paint on their houses. Life here had returned entirely to its old rhythm. The sounds were of bells, footsteps, and the voices of neighbors calling to one another across gardens. Segment 38. Memory and quiet reflection by the middle of the 1920s. The Western Front was something remembered mostly by those who had lived it. In the evenings, older residents of the villages might speak softly of the years before the armistice, but these were quiet stories, told in low voices over a meal or in a small gathering. For the younger generation, the front was a story of the past, one that seemed far away from the calm life they knew. Segment 39. The front fades into time as the decade drew on. The front faded even further. The land along its length looked no different from anywhere else in France or Belgium. Season by season, the villages grew, roads improved, and life continued in its steady pattern. What had once been a line of attention on every map was now a place where people lived their daily lives without pause. The Western Front had become part of the wider landscape, its story now something for books and gentle evenings of conversation. Segment 40, the late 1920 SBI, the late 1920s. The landscape that had once been the Western Front was indistinguishable from the rest of the countryside. The towns had grown more lively, with new shops and small improvements to streets and squares. Children who had been infants during the war were now older, walking to school each morning. They passed old roads that had once been part of supply routes, now lined with hedges and blooming flowers. The land felt whole again, as if the years of steady farming, building, and living had woven the fabric of daily life back together. Segment 41, visitors and gentle tourism. In these years, visitors sometimes came to see places connected to the front. They arrived quietly, walked through small villages, visited memorials, and then moved on. These moments brought a soft connection between past and present. Local residents welcomed them warmly, often offering tea or a quiet conversation about the years gone by. But for the most part, life here was calm, untouched by the movement of travelers. The day still followed the same patterns, marked by seasons, markets, and the flow of the rivers. Segment 42, the early 193 OSAs, the 1930s, began. The world along the old Western Front continued its quiet pace. Motorcars were a more common sight on the roads, but they did not disturb the steady rhythm of village life. Fields still turned from green to gold each year. Orchards still bloomed in the spring, and towns still gathered for markets on their familiar days. The front was now more firmly a story of the past, something known, but distant, like the quiet memory of another time. Segment 43, memory becomes history. By the mid-1930s, even those who remembered the front firsthand spoke of it less often. It had become part of history, something recorded in books, marked on old maps, and remembered in quiet ceremonies each year. The land itself gave no sign of the years when the line had been here. It looked as it always had, peaceful, timeless, part of the enduring countryside of France and Belgium. Segment 44, the gentle ending. As time moved on, the Western Front was no longer a place on the map, nor even a living memory for many. It had become a chapter in the larger story of the world, one that could be read slowly, reflected upon, and then set aside. The fields continued to change with the seasons. The rivers flowed quietly under bridges. The roads carried travelers, farmers, and villagers going about their days. And so, the story of the Western Front ends not with noise, but with stillness. Its lines erased, its towns alive, and its memory carried gently forward. Segment 45, the landscape at peace. As the decades passed, the old Western Front became simply part of the landscape. Fields rolled gently over the earth, touched by wind and sunlight. The villagers bustled softly with life, a baker opening his shop, a farmer tending his animals, children running along cobbled lanes. No trace remained of the years when the front stretched across this land. Only the steady, quiet life of the countryside remained, timeless and unchanging. Segment 46, the passing of time. Time continued its patient work. Years turned into decades, and the people living along the old front lived their lives as generations before them had done. Seasons came and went. Winter frosts gave way to spring blossoms, summer warmth drifted into autumn colors, and the cycle continued without pause. The story of the front was now part of the quiet history of the land, remembered in books, taught in schools, spoken of on calm evenings when the air was still. Segment 47, the soft close of the story. And so, our journey along the Western Front draws to its close. We have moved gently through the years, from the warm summer of 1914, through the steady seasons of the war, into the calm decades that followed. The Western Front is no longer a line, no longer a place of movement. It is simply part of the world, a quiet memory carried by the land itself. You may rest now, knowing the story is complete. The fields are calm, the rivers are still, and time moves forward softly. Segment 48, the 1940s. Begin the 1940s arrived quietly along the land that had once been the Western Front. Though the wider world faced new challenges, here in the small towns and villages, life retained its gentle rhythm. Markets still opened on their regular days. Children walked to school along the same familiar lanes. The rivers still carried their calm reflections beneath stone bridges. The old front was not disturbed. It remained a place of quiet memory. Even as the years moved forward, segment 49, seasons continue, unbroken each year. The land followed its ancient pattern. Spring brought blossoms to the orchards. Summer filled the fields with warmth and light. Autumn turned the leaves to gold, and winter blanketed the countryside in frost. These seasons had turned long before the front, and they continued long after, unchanged in their steady passage. In this place, time seemed endless, each year flowing softly into the next. Segment 50, the mid-century calm. By the 1950s, the villagers along the old front were fully settled into their post-war life. Roads had improved, shops had new signs, and houses had been repaired and painted in fresh colors. But the pace of life was still unhurried. Neighbors still greeted one another in the mornings. Farmers still worked their fields with patience. And the rivers still moved as slowly as they always had, carrying with them the quiet memory of the past. Segment 51. The 1960s arrived. By the 1960s, the towns along the old Western Front had grown a little larger. Some roads had new surfaces, and more motor cars passed along them, but the pace of life here still felt slow, gentle, and measured. Shops sold a few modern goods now, alongside the familiar local produce. Children played new games in the same old squares, and older generations sat quietly outside cafes, watching the days pass. The land itself was unchanged. Fields still rolled over the gentle hills, rivers still curved through the valleys, and each season still returned in its time. Segment 52. The 1970s and steady life. The 1970s brought small changes to daily life. Electric lights glowed warmly in windows at night, and buses began to run regular routes between nearby towns. Yet these changes did not disturb the calm of the land. The rhythm of life was still familiar. Markets still opened in the same squares. Villagers still gathered for festivals in the spring and autumn. The Western Front's memory was still present, but now it was part of history, something remembered with respect. Quietly marked each year. Segment 53. The 1980s and passing. Time. By the 1980s, the old front had become part of a world that was slowly modernizing. Television sets now flickered in the evenings, bringing news and stories from far away. Yet here, along the quiet rivers and rolling fields, life moved no faster. The countryside remained peaceful. Poplar-lined roads still guided travelers into towns where the same markets had been held for generations. The past was remembered in gentle ceremonies, but daily life was focused on the present and on the steady passing of time. Segment 54. The 1990s. Memory and modernity. The 1990s arrived, bringing more visitors from abroad. They came to see the places they had read about in books or seen in documentaries. Local residents welcomed them kindly, guiding them through memorials, showing them the fields and rivers where the front had once been. Yet, for those who lived here, life continued as always. Shops opened in the morning, children walked to school, and evenings were quiet, filled with the soft sounds of conversation and the turning of the seasons. Segment 55. The 2000s. A modern landscape by the early 2000s. The land of the old Western Front was fully part of modern Europe. Highways ran nearby, and trains passed swiftly between cities. Yet along the quiet towns and villages that once stood near the line, the pace remained slow. Shops displayed fresh bread in the mornings, farmers tended their fields, and rivers flowed beneath the same old bridges. Visitors arrived more frequently, walking along marked trails, visiting small museums, and pausing in silent reflection. The memory of the front was cared for quietly, with respect, but life in the region remained peaceful. Segment 56. The 2010s. A gentle present. The 2010s brought even more change to the world. But here the land held its own timeless calm. Small towns grew slowly, with new homes built beside old ones. Electric lights glowed softly along the main streets, and bicycles leaned against cafe walls. The old Western Front was now marked by carefully tended memorials, standing quietly in the fields. Tourists walked past them in hushed voices, their footsteps soft on the paths. For the people living here, the front was both history and heritage, part of the gentle identity of the land. Segment 57. The 2020s. Quiet continuity by the 2020s. More than a century had passed since the front first took shape. The villages and towns thrived in their quiet way, blending modern life with their deep history. The poplar-lined roads still carried cars and bicycles. The fields still swayed with crops, and the rivers still flowed steadily. Every year, in November, the towns gathered to remember, a moment of silence held in the same places where life went on as usual the next day. The Western Front had long since faded as a physical line, but it remained as a soft echo in the land, not in sound, but in memory. Segment 58. The gentle present moment now. More than a century after the first movements along the Western Front, the land is peaceful. The fields stretch quietly beneath the sky. The rivers carry their reflections without hurry, and the towns hum softly with daily life. The front no longer exists as a place, but as a memory carried by the land and the people. It lives in books, in stories, and in the silent moments of remembrance each year. Here, in the present day, life continues with the same steady rhythm it has always known. Calm. MEASURED. Unhurried. Segment 59. A soft farewell, and so we leave the Western Front. As it is today, not a line on a map, but a part of the quiet countryside. Seasons turn as they always have. Winter's frost melts into spring blossoms. Summer's warmth fades into autumn leaves. The land breathes slowly, just as it did long before, and as it will for years to come. You may rest now. The story is complete, and the world grows calm once more.